UK medical training after foundation years is typically what they say 3 to 8 years, depending on what specialty you go. And that is the official time. But the reality is that the gap is much longer and it's only getting wider at the moment. So if you're in a place where you're thinking about going to medical school or you're halfway through med school and thinking about your specialty, here is where we're going to look at the realistic timeline versus what they say on paper. So first, let's look at the options that you have. And I would say that these class into 5 tiers, really. The first is the 3-year option, which is your classic GP training. The next is a 5-year stint, which covers really what I would say the less patient-facing groups. Things like radiology, histopathology, public health, emergency medicine, psychiatry. Then we have the 7-year tier, which includes anesthetics, obstetrics and gynecology, ophthalmology, cardiothoracics, most physician specialties, so most medical specialties within the hospital. So things like cardiology, gastroenterology, and respiratory as well. And then finally, the longest are the 8-year stints, which are things like pediatrics, neurosurgery, basically most surgical specialties like plastics, orthopedics, general surgery, and all of that. So if you're age 18 and thinking, all right, so when am I realistically going to get there? I'm going to talk through that now. Now, the endpoint we typically define as what we call CCT, that's Certificate of Completion of Training. And that is really the endpoint that most people get to. Now, I'm going to talk you through what the earliest possible way that you can get there is for those differing speeds, differing lengths of training that you can get to. But then I'll talk about actually realistically what it's going to look like. So the quickest training, if you're 18, once you've gone through medical school, foundation training and specialty training is GP. And at 18, you can probably expect to do that around the age of 28. Now, if you're going for the more hospital-based specialties, you can expect that to be anything from 13 to 14 years. And that would leave you in your early 30s when you CCT. However, if you go via the longest route, which is either pediatrics or if you go down the surgical route, it can be a lot longer. It can be anything up to like 15 years, and that's the quickest route, and that would leave you CCTing around the age of 33. But as I say, that's if all goes absolutely perfectly, you decide to continue without stopping and just power through all the way non-stop. From the point of applying to medical school, you do 5 years, you do 2 years of foundation training and the shortest possible training time. But that is rarely the case. And there are usually about 6 reasons why people will not progress just non-stop and bulldoze their way through. The first is application competition ratios, right? So especially for the longer ones, they are a lot more competitive. And that means that some people will not get into the next hurdle at some year, whether it's getting into core training for surgery or then specialty training. So say you get into your general surgical training and then you want to carry on to be a plastic surgeon, you might fall at either of those hurdles and might have to do another year working in hospital and then kind of reapply the next year. The second thing, which is now becoming increasingly more common, around 2/3 of people who finish foundation training, so those 2 years after medical school, go on to do what we call an F3 or an F4 year, which is like the medical version of a gap year. Now, people will do this for a variety of reasons, maybe because they want to do what you call locum work, which is like the medical equivalent of being a supply teacher, and you kind of just work on your own schedule, and people have it as a bit more of a depressurized year after the stress of going through med school and starting foundation training. They can also use those years to take a job in a specialty of their choosing before applying to specialty training. So if they have a particular area of interest, or maybe they want to take a bit of time to do something like education or whatever it is to maybe add a different string to their bow, there's a variety of reasons why people take an F3 or even extend it into an F4 year. But that typically adds 1 to 2 years to, I wouldn't call it the training period, but I guess the gap between finishing foundation training and CCTing. One thing that will extend the length of really working as a consultant rather than CCTing is in the surgical specialties, and you have something called a fellowship year. So this is usually when people have finished their registrar training and they want to really specialize within the specialty of a specific thing. So like maybe a orthopedic surgeon might really want to specialize in hand surgery. What they'll do is almost like a year of just going somewhere where their sole goal is to upskill on that. It's called a fellowship year, and it's a year where really all you do is focus on that thing, and it will be related to the thing that you will be doing as a consultant. So basically, just before you really start that first year as a consultant, you're just really kind of sharpening the axe to make sure that you're very strong in that particular thing that you're going to really try and be known for when you become a consultant. A very common thing that people do is take a career break at some point during that training to do a PhD maybe, or some sort of research type stuff, or a master's. So a lot of people do that to add points to their CV, especially the really competitive surgical specialties. You get extra points for having a PhD, so people will take a bit of time out to focus on that. Another thing that's really common these days that you'll hear people refer to is LTFT, which is less than full time. It's becoming increasingly more popular, where people, instead of 5 days a week, will work 4 days a week. And it does work out quite well, especially with people who are having children. A lot of my friends are doing that at the moment. And it does add about 30 to 50% to the training time, but obviously makes the time, the intensity of it, that little bit less stressful, which is helping to preserve against burnout and preserve people's longevity. And the final thing a lot of people are doing these days is dual accreditation. So it's almost like you're doing 2 specialty trainings at the same time. It adds 1 year, but you come out with a CCT basically in both. Now, if you're looking at all of this and thinking, great, but I still need to get into medical school first, then if you'd like some help with your medical school application, the FutureDoc program runs something called the Predictable Offer Protocol, which is a system that has 93% success with getting students into one of their chosen universities. We also have a guarantee that if you don't get in with us, if you are one of those 7% who aren't lucky, then you carry on with us into the next application cycle completely for free. So basically, we have a system that is proven to work, and we back you all the way until we get you that offer. If you'd like to find out more about that, you can either check out this video here talking about it, or submit an application by clicking the link in the description. So now that I've told you the ideal minimum, but also the realities of how those things get extended, let's look at how this applies in real life to all of these different specialty training lengths that I talked about. And the thing that you'll notice is actually the longer the training pathway, the more likely it is to get extended. And that is for a variety of reasons. Sometimes because, for example, in surgery, you actually kind of need to do a PhD for the really competitive specialties to help yourself stand out, and you get points on the application for that. But really, the more punctuation points that you have in that training pathway, the more likely people are just going to take a bit of time out, reflect, and whether it's a career break or use that time to do some of the other things to kind of add strings to their bows, that is a much more likely time that they will do it. So let's get some numbers on screen and look at it. So GP, like I said, if you're just going straight through with no gaps or no interruptions, you're looking at kind of CCTing by age 28. GPs typically, the realistic age is probably more like 29, 30, because you really only have 1 point between CCTing and finishing foundation training, which is that bit between finishing your foundation training and applying to GP training, where you'd like it to take a gap. But once you start GP training, it's very unlikely that you won't just continue to the end. Very few people take a gap mid-training, but it can happen. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we've got things like plastic surgery, neurosurgery, and cardiothoracic surgery. Now, realistically, the CCT age for that will be anything from 35 to 40 years old, versus the very earliest they could do it is about 33. You know, with your cardiothoracics, and really for all surgical specialties, taking an international fellowship is pretty much the norm now, and really doing a PhD as well. So let's look at the typical example pathway for realistically what happens for someone who's maybe doing plastic surgery, and what their CV is going to look like today. So they'll do a 5-year MBBS, so their medical degree. They might even do 6 years if they do an intercalated degree, or even like me, if they did a foundation year before. So then they'll do their 2 foundation years. And maybe, let's say, for example, if they don't get into core surgical training at the first attempt, they might have an F3 year. So they might add another year to that. Might even have 2 of those. So then they'll do their core surgical training, which takes 3 years. And then at that stage, they might do a 2-year research OOP or something like that before getting into plastics as a ST3, so as a registrar. Now, even that, they might take a couple of years to get into that. Some people have to apply several years to get into registrar training for plastics. And for most of those surgical specialties, that is the true bottleneck. That's where people really, that's where people really struggle to get in. And that's the most competitive part, albeit that they've already had the competitive part to get into the core surgical training, then that gets even more competitive there. So then they'll do their specialty training. So they'll start at ST3 all the way to ST8. So 6 years doing that. Then once they've completed that, they might do their 1 year, let's say they might do microsurgery, a fellowship, and they might do that abroad. So that is basically, 12 plus years rather than the 8 that we actually kind of said that you could do ideally. So in reality, that gap between the shortest training pathway and the longest training pathway, whilst on paper looks like it's only 5 years, realistically, it's more like 10 years. And it's important to realize that those minimum numbers aren't the average for a typical surgical trainee, for example. Actually, hitting that in such a small time would make you a unicorn, really. So when people are considering things like plastic surgery and they think to themselves, oh, it's an 8-year commitment, we need to be realistic that it's actually more like a 12+ year commitment. So when you're thinking about your career, here's what I would recommend to think about practically. Don't think just about what interests you at the age of 22. Think about where you want to be at the age of 35. Long pathways aren't necessarily better or bad. You just have to go in with your eyes open. And paradoxically, the short pathways aren't particularly bad or good either. It's where you want to be. But there are some benefits, I guess, to being independent and fully qualified at the age of 28, 29, if you can do that. But basically, these pathways will extend. So build these buffers into your decision making when you are choosing which way to go. So I hope you found that useful. And like I say, if you would like some help with getting into medical school, we have a 93% success rate with our predictable offer protocol. If you'd like to find out more, you can check out this video here or submit an application to join by clicking the link in the description below. But otherwise, thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next video.